Channel 24 now on CarPlay. Top stories without unnecessary clicks.
Hello, friends. My name is Iyer Havrischak. You're watching the YouTube platform of Channel 24. Today is Friday the 13th, and honestly, the events really fit a Friday the 13th. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest, Americanist, political scientist, and PhD in history, Alexandra Filipenko. Alexandra, hello.
Hello, Iyer.
Yes, it's Friday the 13th, and the events really do feel like a Friday the 13th. Alexandra, I'd like to talk with you, of course, about Israel's attack on Iran. What is Trump saying? His latest statement is that he will continue to fund Israel and provide weapons until Iran agrees to some kind of negotiations or to sign some agreements. Officially, Tehran has already said that they will not hold any talks with Trump now. Although, there was supposed to be a meeting in Amman on the 15th. And of course, let's talk about what's happening right now in the United States of America. Because the last thing I saw was, again, the Attorney General, if I'm not mistaken, yes, in San Francisco, banned Trump from using the National Guard to crack down on protests. Let's start with the latest. Alexandra, what's happening right now in the United States of America? How dangerous is this for Americans themselves? How dangerous is this for Trump? Because, as I understand it, the Democrats are already taking up this issue and are even trying to put pressure on the 47th president himself in Congress.
Exactly. But right now, the situation is such that a court, in response to a lawsuit from the Democrats, has temporarily prohibited Donald Trump from deploying the National Guard in Los Angeles. And, in fact, the National Guard is supposed to return under the control of Governor Gavin Newsom. But this isn't the final word yet. There will be an appeal, then an appeal to the appeal, and so on and so forth, until the case reaches the Supreme Court. And Donald Trump is quite confident in his position. Donald Trump is confident that most Americans are on his side, because if you look at polls of American citizens, though it's important to emphasize, this poll was conducted before Donald Trump deployed the National Guard, but well after he used the Immigration Service, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, in the way that he did. He used it for tough detentions of illegal immigrants and was already sending people to prison in El Salvador and so on. In general, this poll from early June shows that 54% of Americans are satisfied with and approve of Donald Trump's actions in the area of immigration. So really, the majority of Americans believe that yes, illegal immigrants should be detained, and yes, they should be deported from the United States. And that's why it's no surprise that Donald Trump was so bold in making this decision. He's completely confident that most Americans are on his side. In fact, even now, after the deployment of the National Guard and the Marine Corps, right in the midst of these protests, on June 10th a YouGov Economist poll was conducted, and it showed the following numbers. 45% disapprove of the protests against the Immigration Service. That is, they disapprove of the protests happening in California. 36% support these protests, and 19% are unsure of their answer. So yes, there is no absolute majority. There aren't more than 50% of Americans who either disapprove or, on the other hand, approve. But the majority in the poll do disapprove of the protests. And this is already after the National Guard and the Marine Corps were deployed. So overall, the topic of immigration policy is more of a winning issue for Donald Trump. And of course, we see the protests, we see everything that's happening. And the images really are sometimes frightening, always striking, but this is happening in very specific areas. It's happening in certain parts of California. It's happening in certain neighborhoods, on certain streets in different cities. A large number of cities have already taken part in the protests or will join in over the weekend. So, protests will continue in California, in Los Angeles, and in San Francisco. In Seattle, Washington, in New York, Atlanta, Georgia, Boston, Massachusetts. There will also be protests in conservative states, in North Carolina, in the city of Charlotte, in Texas, in both Austin and Dallas, and in Kentucky, in Louisville as well. So overall, really, protests are expected in many cities across the US, but still, these are fairly localized protests. They are, after all, isolated demonstrations. So, this certainly affects the public image and the discussion. This topic is very important, but right now it still does not have a decisive impact on Donald Trump's administration. The main thing is, most Americans support the idea of deporting illegal immigrants. This is the winning position for Donald Trump.
Alexandra, I'd also like to ask you about tomorrow's protest. Yes, no to the king, or am I saying it right? Yes, no to the king.
Yes.
What's interesting is that many organizations are going to hold rallies and say that millions of Americans are supposed to take to the streets. But what's interesting is that they want to present it not as a conflict, but as a contrast. Because tomorrow is the birthday of the 47th President of the United States, and there will be a big parade in Washington. As far as I know, there won't be any protests in Washington to avoid conflict. But in other regions, in other states across the United States, people will be protesting. And that's what I wanted to ask about. And also, please tell me, to what extent can we consider, well, the governor of California? I've read a bit about him. He's a charismatic representative of the Democratic Party. Can he be considered, that finally the Democrats have found someone who could potentially be the next leader of their party?
Well, let me start from the end. Indeed, especially if it comes to the Supreme Court and if Gavin Newsom's lawsuit, the governor of California, is upheld by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decides that President Donald Trump did not have the right to deploy the National Guard, that is, to nationalize the National Guard, to federalize it and bring it under his control, as opposed to it being under the control of the governor. At that point, we can basically go ahead and put Gavin Newsom's name right on the 2028 election ballot, because he would, of course, become the automatic candidate from the Democratic Party, or at the very least, one of the main Democratic candidates, since he would be seen as the person who defeated Trump, as someone who overcame Donald Trump's pressure. For Gavin Newsom, who already had presidential ambitions, it's worth noting that in 2023, Gavin Newsom actually conducted a sort of covert polls and a hidden program to study how he is perceived across the United States and how ready Americans are to vote for him. Various polls were conducted in all the American states. And overall, it should be said that at the moment when it became clear to the Democrats, this is something we only found out about recently. At the moment when the Democrats realized in 2023 that Joe Biden was really in a very difficult situation with his health, and that, in reality, something was clearly wrong there. And probably, the White House administration, which was later nicknamed the Politburo, is doing everything it can to push everyone aside and prevent people from realizing what's really going on with Joe Biden's health. In 2023, Bill Daley, a very prominent figure in the Democratic Party, he served as White House Chief of Staff under Obama. He specifically tried to convince Gavin Newsom to run against Joe Biden. That's what he thought. Bill Daley and a few other members of the Democratic Party believed that Gavin Newsom had the best chance of becoming the Democratic candidate back in 2023. In second place was J.B. Pritzker from Illinois, so they tried to persuade them to challenge Joe Biden. That's why Gavin Newsom has actually had presidential ambitions before, and the Democrats supported this idea as well. So, of course, it's fair to say that he definitely sees this as a confrontation, a potential preparation for his own election campaign, basically. So for Gavin Newsom, this is actually probably a good thing. And as for the parade, the military parade, yes, it's the 250th anniversary of the American Army and, coincidentally, Donald Trump's birthday. Well, yeah, as they say, a coincidence. I don't think so, like Russian propagandists used to say. So, really, whether it's a coincidence or not, Donald Trump has wanted a parade for a long time. Back in his first term, he tried to get funding from Congress. He requested money from Congress twice to hold a parade, but COVID ruined all those plans. And, of course, no funds were ever allocated for the parade. In general, holding a parade is really unusual for the United States. Military parades aren't held in the US. Instead, there are reenactments of famous battles, like Civil War reenactments, Revolutionary War reenactments, and other similar events, all in costume. These are theatrical performances. Basically, it's a show. It's kind of like going to a show at Disneyland or Universal Studios. It's not tanks rolling through the Capitol. It's not military equipment in American cities. But now, there will be tanks and military equipment. This isn't typical for the US, and it's something Donald Trump has clearly wanted to do for a long time. He's just that ambitious. Most likely, all of this is actually preparation for the 250th anniversary of the United States, which will be celebrated on July 4th, 2026. So, in this way, Donald Trump wants to kick off the celebration process. And he believes that these $45 million, the $45 million that will be spent on this parade, are simply an opportunity to celebrate American victories. That's how Donald Trump explains it. But not all Americans agree with him.
Alexandra, what do you think? Because you just showed very clearly that this hasn't been done before. No parades, right. Military parades, big, huge ones. It seems to me that this is more typical of some kind of authoritarian regimes. Don't you think that with bringing in the National Guard and with this parade, Trump wants to show people like Kim Jong-un, Xi Jinping, and Putin, whom he truly respects because he'd like to be like them, that he's also a leader, that he can also rattle his saber, that he can also put pressure on Americans if he wants to?
Of course, Donald Trump clearly likes this. He really likes these kinds of images. He likes people like Xi Jinping or Erdogan, or even Putin, not as individuals, but as figures who are in control. He's always saying, "Oh, it's amazing. The leader of China controls so many people. Oh, the leader of Russia controls such a vast territory." That's what somehow fascinates and amazes Donald Trump. He likes this as an image, and as an image, a military parade seems to him like something very important, not just for the US as a whole, but for himself personally, so he can show everyone what incredible capabilities the US really has. Although, of course, we understand, again, knowing history, we've seen many times how the May 9th parades are held in Moscow, and how they're done to showcase Russia's incredible military might, and so on and so forth. And really, after watching these parades, you might actually get the idea, at least in an overheated imagination, that something like Kiev in 3 days is possible. It's exactly from watching these military parades in Moscow. But they don't reflect reality. They don't show what's actually real. These military parades in Moscow, I'm not a military expert myself, so I refer to my colleagues, military experts, and commentators. Alexandra Ginsburg. Even the tanks that took part in the parade turned out not to actually exist. They were just prototypes. So, military parades are often like Potemkin villages that don't really reflect reality. Why does Donald Trump need this? Just to make an impression. It might not reflect reality, but it's meant to impress people. That's why, of course, he wants to show everyone what a strong leader he is. Look at how powerful the presidential authority is. No one has as much power as Trump does. That's why he needs that visual component.
Alexandra, and one last question about the protests and the deployment of the National Guard. And what do you think? Could this escalate into some kind of large-scale confrontation with the potential for Trump's impeachment?
Well, we'll have to see, of course, how the situation develops, and it will all depend on how the Trump administration acts, as well as how the states themselves respond. If, for example, the case goes to the Supreme Court, if the issue of prohibiting Donald Trump from using the National Guard reaches the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court forbids it, but Trump continues or tries to continue using it, then that's already grounds for impeachment. If Trump tries to defy the court, then that's when things could really turn toward impeachment. But at the moment, we see that Donald Trump, reluctantly, very reluctantly, with a lot of resistance and unwillingness, but still, he is complying with the court's decision. Court decisions are being enforced, including, for example, in the case of Abrega Garcia, an undocumented immigrant from El Salvador who was accidentally deported to El Salvador, even though he had a deportation ban. In other words, he was granted protection from deportation back in 2019. And oh, the Trump administration said they would never bring him back. No way, absolutely not. No, no, no. But there was a court decision, several courts actually. The appeal was lost, and they brought him back. They did. So, when the court gives an order, Donald Trump, even if reluctantly, still complies. There is one danger that we really need to pay attention to, a real danger that comes along with these protests. This is something we should pay attention to as well. You might think this is just a coincidence. Maybe it really is a total coincidence. But still, a week ago in Minneapolis, a rumor started spreading, an online rumor on Reddit, in local social networks, in local Minneapolis community groups, that there was a brutal immigration raid happening in the city, a harsh raid. And they're detaining undocumented immigrants who pose no threat, detaining them harshly. Everyone, go out into the streets, stand up for the people who pose no threat. Let the immigration service deal with criminals, criminal undocumented immigrants, not those who are just working in hotels, on construction sites, and so on. In reality, it was just a regular police raid related to a criminal case. But for some reason, rumors started online that it was an immigration raid. Everyone, go out into the streets. When people, a crowd, showed up and tried to demand from the police, where are the undocumented immigrants? Where is immigration enforcement? The Minneapolis police were shocked. There were no undocumented immigrants there. It had nothing to do with illegal immigration at all. So, potentially, of course, this could be used by those forces that want to destabilize the situation inside the US. Of course, if someone really wants to destabilize things, they'll try to do it now, in this heated, tense moment. That's why we can't guarantee that nothing will escalate into a more serious confrontation. But at the moment, it seems that overall, most Americans, first of all, are on Donald Trump's side when it comes to deporting illegal immigrants, and a lot of people also condemn the ongoing protests, so I don't think they'll really spread that widely, at least, as of today, Friday the 13th.
Alexandra, thank you for explaining what's happening in the United States of America. And tonight, on the night of the 13th, Friday, Israel attacked and bombed Iran's nuclear facilities. They also bombed military bases. There are losses among Iran's top military leadership. They also say that there are already 6 killed physicists who were working on Tehran's nuclear program. Well, officially, Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Trump are gossiping that they are not involved with the United States of America. Officially, Iran says that this was a joint strike by Israel and the United States of America. How serious is all this, and how likely is it that there will be another major war, besides Russia's war in Ukraine? And here is the latest statement before we started our conversation. I read that Trump says he will keep funding Israel until Iran agrees to some kind of deal. And Tehran says, no negotiations with the US.
Well, in fact, the 6th round of negotiations was scheduled for Sunday in Amman. The 6th round of talks between the US and Iran was supposed to take place. Now Tehran is saying that there will be no negotiations at all. Nevertheless, in his latest statement, Donald Trump warned Iran that the consequences of refusing a deal with the US would be far worse than anything they expect. That's a quote from Donald Trump's statement. The US produces the most lethal weapons in the world. Israel also has them at its disposal. There is still time for Iran to make a deal with the US, but if they refuse, things will only get worse. So, basically, Donald Trump has now really moved on to making very tough statements. At 5 p.m. Central European Time, 6 p.m. Kiev time, there will be a meeting of Donald Trump's National Security Council. And there, the issues concerning Iran will be discussed. Most likely, by that time, they are expecting some kind of response from Iran. And, possibly, there will be some additional statements as well. I would like to point out that the first official statement, specifically, the official one, before Trump's statement, the first official statement from the administration came from Marco Rubio, from the Secretary of State. In other words, diplomacy is what's coming first. The need for negotiations, this highlights the United States' desire to continue diplomatic efforts. Marco Rubio wrote on social media, on the official State Department social media accounts, "We are not involved in carrying out strikes on Iran. Let me be clear, Iran should not strike at American interests or personnel. So, the US has stated that they will defend their interests and personnel, but if there are no strikes, then let's keep talking. Well, in general, American politicians are indeed saying that there is still a chance to continue negotiations. After all, negotiations are what Donald Trump wants to see, but it's unclear how Tehran will respond to that. It's important here, I think, to emphasize that in the current situation, Donald Trump's idea of handing over part of the responsibility for Iran to Russia is already fading into the background. After all, there was a proposal from Moscow to supply Iran with nuclear material, more precisely, enriched uranium, up to a certain level, so that it could be used for peaceful atomic energy, for absolutely normal, peaceful purposes. But now it turns out that Vladimir Putin won't be needed by Donald Trump. None of that will be necessary, because if the situation is like this, if there are no negotiations, then he's even less needed. If negotiations do take place, then the pressure here will probably be much tougher. And now, even the talk about Moscow participating in this will likely fade into the background. That is, Vladimir Putin will no longer need Donald Trump. Well, of course, we'll be keeping an eye on how all of this develops. At the moment, the American side is still counting on negotiations.
Alexandra, thank you for talking about Iran and for the way you explain things to me and our viewers so that everyone understands, because unfortunately, in Ukraine, people know very little about the processes in the Middle East. They just know that there is Israel and there are those who want to attack Israel. But very few people know the nuances. I would also like to ask you about this. If I'm not mistaken, both Keith Kellogg, whom I will quote now, and, if I'm not mistaken, Kurt Volker, the former U.S. Special Representative for Ukraine, have spoken about it. He says that Trump is naive and, excuse me, also the former CIA director from 2014 to 2017, I can't recall his last name right now, but they said the following, that both Trump and Vilkov have a very superficial understanding of what is happening in Ukraine. That's exactly why yesterday Trump said that 51 million people from Russia were killed in the war. How can you love that? It's interesting. Everyone doesn't like Russia, but they love Japan and Germany. Obviously, this is after his conversations with Putin, after whatever Putin told him. But that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is that maybe people in America also don't really understand the essence of what's happening in Ukraine. And so, Keith Kellogg, I'll quote him, his words are really important for Americans, both in America and in the White House, to understand what's going on. He said the following, President Zelensky is fighting a war for the survival of his nation on his own land. And that's exactly what Abraham Lincoln did. He fought on his own land for the survival of the nation and for national sovereignty. And when you see that, you have to understand the problems they're facing right now on the battlefield. He also says that sometimes we don't see the whole picture, we don't put ourselves in their shoes, and we don't understand what's happening or how to fix it. But we really try hard to do that. So, Alexandra, to what extent does this comparison with Lincoln help Americans understand? Does it make the issue of Ukraine feel closer to them and help explain Russia's war in Ukraine?
Of course, this is exactly what needs to be explained to Americans in general, because we really have to recognize that American citizens don't necessarily have a deep understanding of these processes. There's this perception that there's an ocean between us, and that Ukraine and Russia are both very, very far away, and people only have some superficial, general ideas about what's happening. But it's really difficult to understand all the nuances. And in this sense, for example, that conversation Tucker Carlson had with Vladimir Putin played a very negative role in how the war between Russia and Ukraine is perceived, because a huge number of Americans, even without listening to that half hour of Kremlin narrative, still thought, maybe there's something to this, maybe there's something to it. That was exactly Vladimir Putin's goal, to suggest that there's more to this, that it's not just happening for no reason. But of course, it should be said that Americans' attention and knowledge, at least among those who follow politics, are largely focused on their own continent. They would understand much more, let's say, if there were some kind of confrontation between, for example, Venezuela and Colombia, or, say, between Bolivia and Brazil, something along those lines. That would make more sense to Americans in terms of how and why these processes are happening, and so on. But on another continent, it's very far away. And when such simple examples are given, ones that are completely clear to Americans, it definitely helps with understanding. Overall, well, I think that a huge number of dissertations, scientific papers, books, and monographs will still be written about the personality of Volodymyr Zelensky and about the role his personality played in the US helping Ukraine. Because how did Americans perceive him? Well, because he was a young actor, there was something a bit Reagan-like about him at a time when Americans themselves had these older politicians. Here are Biden and Trump. So how does that work? And here comes someone young, and so on. This is a huge, big topic. The role of personality in history, really. And that's why, when you give some simple examples to help people understand, it really helps. It's with these kinds of simple examples that you need to help people grasp it, so to speak. Well, since, of course, Russian propaganda never sleeps, and it should be said that through those sources funded, for example, by the Russia Today channel, there are a large number of bloggers in the US. After all, a whole network of these bloggers was exposed, who were originally paid by Russia Today. They talked a lot about how, well, it's like if California were to secede from the US, just to bring up California, and then, years later, something like that happened. How can you even compare that, and so on? It's a completely different story altogether. So that's how the propaganda side explains it, in very simple terms, very simply. And of course, that also has its own impact. That's why it's important. Of course, these statements matter, these comparisons matter.
Alexandra, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you for your explanations, for the way you highlight the key points and help me and our viewers better understand what's really happening this Friday the 13th. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you for having me.
Let me remind viewers, we were joined by Alexandra Filipenko, a political scientist, Americanist, and PhD in history. Subscribe, comment, and send your questions. In upcoming broadcasts, we'll discuss everything. And we'll leave Elon Musk for our next broadcasts. See you next time.
Thank you.